Hi guys, Patrick here, Eggnot Poker. Going to be doing a three-part, maybe four, but probably three-part series focusing on pre-flop, going through some of the ins and outs of the pre-flop poker tree that I think, again, what we touched about in the last video, a lot of these things are going to be not covered in a lot of content that I think is out there, and I think it's quite important, which a lot of people aren't really focusing on, especially in again, we're going to be focusing on the micro to low stakes, which will be 2 and L up to 50. There'll be some different considerations per stake, but we're primarily focusing on the micro to low stakes, looking at what kind of things we can do, what kind of considerations we should be making, a lot of exploit thought processes, a lot of adaptation, a lot of exploitation, rather than just GTO thought processes going into this presentation. So we're just going to get straight into it, and hopefully, like, bit of a disclaimer, it might be a bit of a long video as always, unfortunately, but I'm going to put it into a couple of 35 minute segments, 3 to 4 segments, so it's going to be a lot of detail to take in, so bear with me. So let's start off. I think every single one of these points are going to be important, but one of the most important mindsets is when thinking about low stakes and micro stakes especially, is there isn't a rule book, there isn't a what's the best way to say it? There isn't a specific way to playing. So if you think about GTO, for example, chucked out there all the time is this dreaded abbreviation GTO, Game Theory Optimal, where everyone's like, right, this is how to play. These are the charts. These are the ranges. These are your... obviously, it's not as simple as this, but these are the considerations. These are the bet sizings you choose. Excuse me. You're using random number generators. You're just mainly focusing on your specific hand, your range, your position on the table, rather than villain type, or any exploitations at all. We're not really thinking, we're just focusing on playing like an ABC, a good ABC strategy, but that may not be the only best way to win, especially in these lower levels. Honestly, it's not. There are a lot of concepts from GTO that are important, which we'll look at in this slideshow, but actually a lot of the top win rates and just having a win rate at all will actually come from exploitation and focusing on deviating a lot from the normality of the game to a high level. For example, if you're playing like NL200, NL500, you don't need this video at all. You're better than me, far better, playing away. But just your considerations at that level are mainly towards just, you will have curveballs, you will play exploitatively on your opponents, and you should be at that level of gameplay. But the priority is mainly focusing on fundamental strategy, where you're basically playing fundamentally sound and unexploitable, and then you'll just go from there. Whereas the low levels mainly focus on this exploitation. So, moving on and starting off this presentation, we're going to begin with positive and open-minded approach to these games, rather than just being robotic and fearful. So, thinking about breaking away from rules, well, if we're even going to implement these rules, we need to have a good mindset. We need to have a good lunch or dinner before we start. We need to be fueled. We need to be hydrated. We need to have a good night's sleep before. This all sounds pretty simple, but it's extremely important to not be stressed out, to not be hungry, not be tired, to not be pissed off by something that's happened in the day or whatever. You need to really focus on, as a priority, and I think this is overlooked, is just this physical and mental mindset. Again, I think a lot of players just kind of jump in, tired, miserable, whatever, focusing on, nothing in particular, see how it goes. It's really important that we focus on, being hydrated and focusing on your fuel. I'm not saying you need to meditate and follow a really, really strict diet to play well, but, it's important to at least consider it. And moving on, we're also going to not only focus specifically on standard and predictable lines in GTO, so that's something we kind of just started talking about before, is we just want a mindset of making the most money in a vacuum every single hand we play. I know a lot of this is going to sound quite boring, maybe a bit repetitive and not particularly interesting in this video, but this is more of an academic video and a mindset realization, rather than we're going to sit here and make this video super fun and interesting. Because technically, if you're a losing player or not a very strong player, or you're like breaking even and rate backs kind of keeping you alive or whatever, there's a lot of stuff that you need to be thinking about and doing, which you're not. And you're going to be getting a lot of that information, especially for free, in this presentation today. So like I said, this may not be particularly fun or interesting, but it's absolutely relative and it's very, very useful. This I can promise you. So moving on, like we said, we wanted to exploit every situation we can. So what does that mean? Like, think of it like this. We'll go into some specifics as we go on, but just generalizations first. You should be treating every situation with utmost respect, whether it's a 1 big blind pot, a 10 big blind pot, or a 100 big blind pot. They're all the same. You must exploit these. So, for example, if you're in a situation where you're like, you're against a nitty opponent, right? And you're being 4-bet, and you've got a hand like ace queen suited, you've got a hand like tens, you've got a hand like jacks. Against a correct range and a correct opponent, you can make a lot of money by playing in certain ways. You can, depending on the positions and your roles, you can potentially call, fold, you can 4-bet. Lots of different things you can do with different types of holdings in positions versus 3-bets. But if we're against an opponent that only 3-bets or 4-bets a hand like aces, kings, queens, and you can, back this up with HUD stats, relative HUD stats, then, we might need to just deviate from having a balanced approach and maybe just folding completely, or set mining with a deep stack, for example, rather than just playing it as a continue. Remember, we're not being exploited nowhere near as much as you think you are. So you don't need to have super balanced lines and super balanced and protected ranges. People are going to know roughly with their HUDs like what kind of hands you're opening and what kind of hands you're 3-betting, etc. But you're not being super death exploited, right? So you really don't need to see it as a super big priority. If you're playing 10 an hour, 25 an hour, people don't really care what you do or how you do it. They will look at it and they will have some exploitations, but not really. Like, it's not a massive thing, honestly. It's just, I wouldn't worry about it. Like, if you've got a spot that that you can absolutely go out to sea with and bluff with, then do it, because they're not going to see it. They're not going to look for it. They're just going to see what's in front of them. Opening ranges. So, opening ranges is a big one. Fundamentally, the mistakes you make pre-flop are going to compound themselves post-flop. Again, that seems pretty obvious, but I think a lot of people don't see it. Like, in 2022 today, I think a lot of players, even the weaker players, at least have some kind of fundamental idea of what hands they need to be opening, apart from the absolute lowest levels. Like, if you're playing 10 and L, the average regular player, whether they're terrible or not, I think still understands roughly what kind of hands they can open and 3-bet, etc. But we're mainly focusing on opening to start with. The only difference is they might be just a bit tight in general, right? But they're just not opening wide enough. So when you're playing, to begin with, when you're thinking about playing these games and trying to win, and this is again focused at people who are like break even or losers in the game, unfortunately, especially at the low levels, you need to ask yourself this question right now. Do you know what ranges you should be opening, give or take, from all positions? Just opening, raise first in, RFI. If I say to you, right, you're under the gun, what's the weakest hand you think you can open under the gun in a 2-L or 5-L environment? If your answer is a hand like Ace Jack plus, or, King Queen plus, King Queen suited plus, you need to be reconsidering quite heavily what hands you're opening. I'm not saying it's bad, because some populations it's good to open tighter and larger, but in general, we need to absolutely be opening quite wide ranges. If you don't know what ranges to open, these will change based on the populations, right? Like, again, we'll go over this later, but if you're against a tight population, you can just open and they're passive and they fold or whatever a lot. You can just open really, really wide and not really get, you're not going to get punished for it. Whereas if you're against like a quite aggressive population, you've got quite a lot of aggressive people behind you, you're going to be a little bit tighter, aren't you? Because you don't want to open loads and loads of hands and just get 3-bet all the time, for example. So it will change and you'll adapt it based on who's behind you in general. But I would suggest, like, I don't do coaching, right? So in terms of population and ranges, etc., I would say that you need to start looking for go on Google, look for GTO Wizard. That's one I use. I'm not saying it's the be all end all, I'm not saying it's the best or the worst, but it's what I use, and I would use it as a recommendation. And you can, for free, you can see the opening ranges of the cash 6 max. If you go in 15L general, 100 big blind deep, 100 big blind deep, you can see all the general rough opening ranges. At least use them as a guide, and then you can start going wider or tighter based on the populations and getting game pools that you're playing in. So moving forward with that, we want to be opening as wide as you can get away with. So, for example, if you're in a tight population, which, let's face it, 2L up to like 15L is extremely tight, it is quite 3-bet heavy, but the actual ranges are very tight in general of most regulars. we need to be opening hands such as things like King 5 suited under the gun, King 8 suited, pocket 6s plus. You can actually open worse pocket pairs, but we'll go for that later. Queen Jack offsuit, Ace 10 off, etc. And then a little bit wider as we go around the tree. Today's video isn't to just sit here and just study pre-flop ranges. It's just to think about them. Excuse me, as a generalization. But these kind of examples here, these are hands that you need to be thinking about opening under the gun, like King 5 suited 6s, Queen Jack off, Ace 10 off, and etc. And above. Especially in these populations where people are just folding a lot, you know. The only deviation we can take though is when you think about opening ranges, look ahead to see if people behind you are weaker or stronger players. Have a look at if they're 3-betting quite often and what those ranges look like, and see if you've got recreationals behind. So if you've got recreationals in the blinds, for example, you want to open really wide and you want to get involved with those. You want to isolate those players, especially in position against the blinds if we're raising under the gun, etc. And just making money post-flop from them. We can make them fold, we can get calls from them. If we make big hands, etc., we're going to be doing quite well against them overall. If we've got a bunch of crazy maniacs behind us and they're 3-betting loads, whether it's correct or not, then we may not want to open a hand like King 5 suited, knowing that we're going to get 3-bet a lot. And especially if we don't have a correct 4-bet strategy or folding strategy as well. So just as a thing, remember you're not relying just on correct ranges. Those ranges change depending on your population and the games that you play. So if you're a 2NL player and you kind of play a bit recreationally, you don't really know what charts to open, you've got a suggestion for where to go and find some charts. But in general as well, just think about it, right? Don't just open like top 10% of hands under the gun, you know, mix it up. Spread out your range a bit and play more hands against people. So some open range examples. So what I'm going to do for an example is I'm going to bring up a site here. This is just an odds calculator. Only going to use it for the sake of putting in some hands. So what I'm going to do here, I'm going to zoom this in a little bit. Bear with me. Is we're going to focus on opening ranges. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples. So I'm going to say that I'm under the gun. I would let's quiz it. I've got Ace 6 offsuit under the gun. What do you think? Do you think this can be an open under the gun? Do you think it's a profitable open? What do you think? Well, honestly, what I would suggest is this would not be a good open, okay? If you're under the gun, like we said, in general, without thinking about ranges, if you know nothing about ranges, this is for you. We would suggest opening something like Ace 10 off under the gun and above. If you've got recreationals in the blinds, then we might start considering open a little bit wider, like Ace 9 off, for example. But then we're starting to get a little bit dicey. However, if we've got hands like a suited ace, like Ace 3 suited, for example, this would be a really good open. This would be a pretty decent open under the gun, okay? This might only deviate is if we've got aggressive opponents behind us and we say, look, we've got the Ace 3, I'm going to be folding a lot to 3-bets, these guys are going to be 3-betting quite wide, we may just pitch this pre-flop, okay? In terms of hands like connectors, so things like 6-7 suited, let's go under the gun here. In theory, just as a piece of information, when you're raising in the earlier positions, these hands like the lowest connectors, things like Deuce 3, 3, 4, etc., you don't really open these, okay? Hands like 4, 5 suited, 5, 6 suited, 6, 7, 7, 8, etc., these will start opening, but they'll only really open a very small amount, like somewhere around 10 or below % of the time under the gun, and then very, very small amount more as they go up. And then towards the cutoff on the button, these become larger opens. The main reason is these don't, like when you're opening in the early positions, you're mainly looking for polarized hands. So which basically means pretty good hands or pretty trashy hands, rather than just linear. You're being careful with some of the linear hands that you would open, things like King Queen off, etc., or Queen Jack off, for example. You'd only open some of the time. 4, 5 suited doesn't have any properties in it. It doesn't block an Ace X, a King X, a Queen X. It doesn't block any potential 3-bets behind. You would only theoretically have this in your range a very, very small amount of the time in the early position, so it would be part of your strategy post-flop. So you know you've got this as part of your range. You don't need to think about that at the micro stakes and the low stakes. So what you need to be considering is, if I've got these fishy players in the blinds, I may only have 4-5 suited here, but if you can play competently post-flop, and again, disclaimer, this isn't to sit here and spend 30 hours going through how to play 5-4 suited profitably against recreational players in position. This is just a generalization again. So this can be a profitable open, okay, against recreational players in position. However, again, with the aggressive players behind, we might want to start considering not opening this, as this wouldn't be part of our 4-betting range, and we don't want to defend this against a 3-bet in these populations, in these games. What we're looking for primarily is, like, I don't just want to say we've got the nuts, but we're looking for hands like ace-king. We're looking for hands like pocket queens. We're looking for hands like king-queen suited. These are our natural nutted hands under the gun. Well, excellent. But we can broaden that, right? So we can just have pocket sevens. We can have hands like king-jack offsuit, right? We can have hands like king 5 suited, king 8 suited. These are absolutely perfectly fine to open as well, especially if you've got recreationals behind, which you're going to often have in these low stakes games. You're going to have to start understanding where this money comes from, and this absolutely is something we're going to look at in another slide, so I don't want to go over it too much now. But you cannot win by just waiting for the nuts. Like, don't get me wrong, like, if you don't do it in, you wait and sit for good hands, you will make money, but it's very slow. And in terms of like learning how to beat the game, if you're only barely profiting at the micro stakes because you're only playing the nuts and you're not really calling anybody, you're not really, like, you know, doing it in or anything silly, you're not going to learn how to really identify how to play properly as you climb up. So I would think about that as a consideration. If you start opening things like on the button, for example, so we go late position, you know, so all of a sudden these hands like 5-6 suited become really profitable opens as no matter who you've got behind in the blinds, because you're guaranteed position and the ranges are naturally going to be wider. And then when you get to places like the small blind, now we can start opening up hands like jack 9 off a bit more often. Although we can absolutely open that in other positions too. Another good example would be something like 5-7 suited, or like queen 3 suited or something. These become better opens as you get later on down the tree, around the table, compared to opening under the gun. So moving back to the presentation, excuse me, itchy nose. We need to understand, as we said, where this money is coming from. So technically, if I'm not a winning player, or I'm barely breaking even, or whatever, with or without rake back, I don't know what's going on. I don't really know how to improve. It's not just strategy. It's also just an understanding of how the populations are playing, how to play and deviate versus them, and also understanding how you're making money in the game. So technically speaking, if a game of poker, 2 people play, 5 cards are dealt in the middle, we see who wins, right? Well, yeah, there's rounds of betting and everything that goes into that as well. But technically, the fundamental way to play the game is to try and make the best hand, put money in, get value for it, and someone pays you with a hand they think is winning, but isn't, right? In terms of understanding where this money's coming from and using that information to become profitable, then this money is mainly coming from, I mean, again, this is going to sound obvious, but this money is mainly coming from weaker players, okay? So when you're playing recreational players especially, rather than just nits or type regs or whatever, these are your main targets. So again, anyone can say, yeah, you're targeting weaker players, you want to put money in when you've got good hands against them. Well, yeah, that is true. But it's not emphasized. Like, honestly, your strategy needs to change based on who you're playing against. So, for example, this is a mindset thing, right? This is not something that's usually thought about. If I'm going to play 10NL, 5NL, 2NL, whatever, like the super low stakes, the super micro stakes, those are mainly the people that you're making the money from. Like, you don't want to go after and target, especially if you're losing player and you don't really study anything fundamentally or strategically. You just want to focus on playing better hands in general and just betting them when you have something and making money from those players, because they will call you with worse. They're gonna raise call the 3-bet with ace 7 offsuit. The board's gonna be ace high. You're gonna value bet ace queen for 3 streets, and they're gonna pay. There we go. For example. That's not emphasized, I think. Like, when you have a good hand, you need to be blasting the money in and getting called by these recreational players. Stop trying to trap them. Stop trying to play technical. Stop trying to play funny. Don't flop Broadway and check back the flop. Put money in the middle, right? Okay, if you're going to check raise, whatever, fine. But put the money in.
You have to start building the pots when you've got good hands. Please don't try and trap and play funny and mess about, because these people will pay. Like, especially the recreationals and the worst recreationals will pay, right? So get the money and get the value. We need to reduce the SPR, the stack to pot ratio, and the size of the pot. We need to build these pots on the pre-flop flop turn to get money in and stacks in by rivers, depending on the stack sizes, obviously. But if you've got the nuts and you're betting the river, but the pot's only 15 big blinds, it's really hard to get lots of money in, right? Whereas if you've got to the river and the pot's like 90 big blinds, it's far easier to get like 70 big blinds in on the river compared to if it's 10. So we need to absolutely be thinking about the pot geometry and putting money in. Another thing to think about is actually, and this again also I don't think is ever thought about, is a lot of small to medium pots through red line. So red line is when you're, as we said in the previous video, is when you don't have to technically be bluffing, but it's just a pot one without showdown. Whether you've bet a street and someone's folded, or you've raised and made someone fold, for example. You could be bluffing, could be value betting, whatever. But a lot of pots are played very, very passively at the low to micro stakes. So, for example, I'm assuming this is going to be something that's relative to you. If you're playing in lots of positions where you've got, like, you know, ace 10 and the board could be anything. You know, showdown value is important, but there'll be a lot of times where your range will interact, like, for example, especially late positions and blinds, your range will interact with a board like 6, 7, 9, and it will be apparent that your range will interact with it even against a weaker opponent most of the time. These people check and you check back with some marginal showdown, fine, but I think a lot of people default check to give up, or check to hope your opponent doesn't bet and then fold if opponent does bet on a later street and then just don't win. Lots of small and medium pots are just not blasted through and not picked up enough, which absolutely kills the win rate in the long term. And these people only rely on sold cold decks like aces v kings and set over set and whatever to win a pot. Not necessarily even just win in general, but just win a pot, rather than being like, right, look, this guy's checked. I'm not really much showdown value here. This is a relatively decent board for me. I'm just going to go ahead and try and pick it up. It's a lot of people, especially the tight opponents, are just leaving dead money in the middle, not going after any of these small to medium pots and just insta-folding to go to the next hand without really thinking about the money that's left in the middle. These pots are super important. You need to absolutely respect every pot that comes up. If this is a pot where it might, for example, go raise call, you call on the big blind, the button, for example, the big blind defends, you multi-way, the board's like 5, 7, 10, you've got king jack, backdoor straight and flush draw in position, it checks round to you, the initial raiser checks and it's capped, you know, the big blind cold caller probably doesn't have a super good hand. Don't just check and assume that, you know, you just want to try and improve or fold or whatever. This might be an opportunity for you to pick up a decent pot. You know, if I pick up a 10 big blind pot most of the time by betting, especially if it checks round, go after them a lot of the time, because it's like winning an extra 10 big blinds every 20 minutes or 30 minutes. That's another pot and another pot and another pot, and all these little 5 to 10 big blind pots, they add up and they add up to a stack, and that's another stack that you've made without just focusing on flopping a set against an overpair. You have to think about these positions to try and situations to try and make extra money. So these small pots are just as important as big pots, red line and bluff catches. That's just what we've said. The only thing that we might deviate with is bluff catching. I think at the micro stakes, especially 2NL up to like 25-50, that's more low stakes, but especially the micros up to 10NL, I'd be very cautious about bluff catching unless it's a very specific situation. Your money is not coming from making huge hero calls. It's not coming from making 5-bet bluffs. It's mainly coming from bluffing people in small to medium situations, bluffing a lot of cap ranges and turns and rivers, and those are the small to medium spots. And it's coming from just betting good hands against recreationals. It's that simple. So don't make it really complicated. And then maximizing value in every pot. We've spoken about that one. So remember, you need to respect every single pot to maximize your win rate. As we said, you must respect these spots. Don't just see a 3 big blind pot and an auto fold as an acceptable thing, because it's not. Okay, it's really not. You need to be going after these pots where you can. So we're going to go into. I'm going to carry on with part 1 here. I'm not going to make this separate because there's a couple of slides for being 3-bet and how to deal with it. So what we're going to do now is we're going to focus on we're opening a hand and we're being 3-bet all the time. What can we do about it? I think a lot of misconceptions here, again, with like losing players and like break-even players, micro to low stakes, is they don't really know how to deal and combat with 3-betting. I think they open a decently tight range, perhaps too tight, get 3-bet, and then go into like, they get frozen and they're like, what do I do? I'm not really sure how to play against this. I'll just fold or I'll just call. I don't really know. We'll go from there. I think a lot of people make these mistakes where they're calling far too much out of position and not 4-betting enough or not folding enough at any stake. Now, again, if you're playing 2-0 up to say 10-0, I would probably be cautious about how much of the next couple of slides you take in regarding like the 4-bet bluffing, for example, as that's something a bit more technical and something that will require a lot of work and not good just as something to pick up off the fly and attempt on your own. If you're playing 25 and 50-0, 4-bet bluffing is something that is absolutely required. I don't know about 10-0. I haven't played 10-0 for a long time. I'm sorry, I don't know. 25 and 50... 25 and 0, I'm not sure, but I would assume that, and 50 and 0 absolutely are levels where you need to be considering having 4-bet bluffs and more folds out of position to 3-bets, and then defending correctly to then play post flop. Let's get into the specifics here, and then we'll continue. So, being 3-bet is tough to deal with, and quite hard. It's quite hard to deal with. It's quite hard to manage. It's quite irritating as well, right? So being 3-bet is tough to deal with properly at any level of the game tree. Try and think about these mindsets to help you through it. So first of all, we need to think about information. So what villain type is 3-betting us and what positions are we on the table? So for example, if we raise, let's say under the gun, and the hijack, which is the next position behind us in a 6-max game, 3-bets us. The first thing we should be doing is not looking at our hand. It should be looking at our opponent in the position. So we say, right, okay, do I have any information? If the answer is yes, we know he's a tight whale, a tight whale, passive whale, an aggressive maniac, a decent reg, a fish, an unknown. What positions are we in? If you're in the earlier positions, obviously the hand strengths are going to naturally be tighter. Even at the lower levels, I think maybe more exaggerated at the lower levels compared to being in like blind on blind or button on big blind, for example. Most people will generally be quite tight with their 3-betting, but I'm not saying that people cannot 3-bet bluff, because they absolutely do at all levels. But it's really important you think about this type of information rather than just going, I have ace queen, this is what I'm going to do against them. If you don't study GTO and don't know what fundamentally to do against 3-betting, even if some of it may be irrelevant to the lowest stakes, you cannot just guess. You have to think about you have to be more sort of dumbed down and fundamental. You have to think about what opponent type you're against. Now we need to think about what decision-making processes we want. Do we have any HUD information as well? Can I literally say to myself, right, this guy's 3-betting 17% of the time, 20% of the time, he's playing 40% of hands, 35% of hands, he's raising all over the place, but then he's folding to 4-bets a lot. Well, this might be a good opportunity to chuck in a 4-bet bluff, or chuck in a hand like ace queen off as a 4-bet rather than just calling out a position, which isn't great anyway. Previous history or notes on the villain. Again, similar to what villain type. Do we have a history? Have we played with them before? Have they just spazzed out 3-bet with jack 7 offsuit, blasted, jammed all in on the river with absolute nothing that doesn't block anything and makes no sense? That's really important information to know if you're considering calling with a hand like king jack suited, for example. And then thinking about what decision and action are we going to make based on the information and the thought processes we put in place. We need to decide whether we want to think about folding, defending as a call, or defending as a 4-bet. So 4-betting is based on information available, and if we have no information, again, we just revert to fundamental strategy. That's like loads of stuff to just take in. Think about it like this, okay? If you don't know how to 4-bet people, and you have no clue what you're doing with it, do not do it for bluffs. Only do it for value, right? Because you're going to hurt yourself and get confused and be in a lot of really awkward spots when people continue. If you have information that they do fold a lot to 4-bets and they 3-bet really, really wide, then think about it having a couple of them in there. But generally, this isn't a priority to 4-bet bluff people at the lowest levels. At more like at the higher end of the low stakes, like 50 and L, for example, 25 and L, I don't know about 16, but these are going to be quite important because a lot of people, especially the regulars, are kind of a bit spazzy with their 3-bets. They'll over 3-bet a bit because they know it works a lot, but then overfold versus re-aggression. That's kind of the difference between 50, 100, 200. Is you start looking at players who are just balanced in all levels of the game tree. They don't just 3-bet way too often and then fall out of their ass when they get 4-bet, for example. Anyway, moving forward, generally something to think about. Calling 3-bets out of position generally isn't preferred in GTO. Even fundamental calls out of position to 3-bets are usually quite bad, and they make the game really difficult to play for yourself, even if you've got a big edge. And a lot of times 4-betting and folding is preferred, but you will absolutely have to have some hands, especially out of position as well, that will defend versus 4-bets. We'll think about that in a minute. But it's something to think about at least. Okay. Remember, becoming fluent and confident in 3-bet and 4-bet pots is absolutely vital to succeed. It really is, guys. Again, this isn't... we're not going to sit here for hours, excuse me, talking about 3-betting and 4-betting, okay? But what we absolutely are going to do is think about some generalizations with strategy pre-flop that we can do to counter being 3-bet. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move on to the second slide for this. I'm going to pause this video now and we're going to move on to part 2. So stay tuned.